The morning opened pale over the hills of southern Tennessee, a soft light spilling across fields that had been left to rest through many winters. The road that climbed toward the old convent was narrow and rutted, a ribbon of packed dirt bordered by cedar and oak. A chill moved through the trees and brushed the grass in long, even strokes. A small pickup eased along the last bend and came to a quiet stop beside a stone wall worn smooth by time. Dorothy stepped down with careful feet, paused, and looked up at the building that would now shelter her days. The convent had the stillness of places that have listened more than they have spoken. Its limestone walls carried stains of rain and heat and years of wind. Ivy clung to cracks and corners. The bell tower leaned just a touch, as if tired from keeping watch for generations. Windows that once caught sunlight during long hours of prayer were now filmed with dust, though a few panes still brightened when the sky cleared. The wooden door at the entrance held a simple cross, carved by hands that had believed in work that lasted. Dorothy stood a moment longer and measured her breath. She had not come for comfort. She had come for quiet, and perhaps for something the heart sometimes finds when noise is gone. She carried 2 suitcases and a folded quilt. A box of tea and an iron kettle sat in the truck bed, along with a lantern and a tin of matches. A man from town had offered to drive her up the hill and had done so without questions. He had nodded once at the sight of the building and kept his eyes forward the rest of the way. When the engine went silent, the land opened its small sounds. A bird called from a fence post. Dry leaves moved along the path. Somewhere beyond the trees, water pushed over stone with a steady patience that reminded Dorothy of long Sundays from another life. Inside, her footsteps made an honest echo. The corridor stretched straight and narrow, the floorboards sound under her weight, the air cool and layered with scents of old wax and weathered wood. Doors stood along each side, some closed, some open to rooms that held chairs with missing rungs and shelves bent under the memory of books. In the main hall, light fell in a soft square through a high window and revealed a scattering of dust that rose and turned with every step she took. Dorothy set her bags near a room that faced east and pushed the window up an inch. Fresh air slid in and brought the smell of grass from the slope below. She did not plan to fix what time had already claimed. She would clean what she needed, mend what she could, and let the rest stand as witness. The church in town had offered the convent as a caretaker place, a shelter in exchange for tending the grounds and keeping the property from slipping further into ruin. It suited her. She had known noise and hands that grabbed at what was left. She had known rooms that held more talk than truth. Here she could tend, and tending felt like a prayer a body could keep even when words failed. She found the kitchen at the back, simple and square, with a stone sink beneath a small window. A wooden table stood steady near the center. The stovepipe had rusted, but her little camp stove would do until she could sort something better. She boiled water, watched the steam rise in a fine thread, and let the quiet hold her. The taste of the first cup was plain and good. She stood by the window while she drank and looked out at the patch of land that had once been a garden. Fence posts leaned but held. The outlines of beds still showed through weeds. She could almost see hands moving there again in seasons to come. By midday, she had swept the corridor and cleared the east room. She shook the quilt and laid it over a cot she found against the wall. She wiped the window glass with a clean rag and watched the world sharpen from grey to something near blue. The hills sat patient in the distance. A hawk traced slow circles above a stand of trees. Clouds moved in a wide herd and set a kind shade over the slope. The air in the room warmed a little, enough to remind her that days turn even when a person thinks they will not. She walked the building with a steady pace, not hurrying, not trying to gather more than her hands could hold. She found a small library with shelves built straight into the wall. Many books had been taken long ago. A few remained, the leather cracked and edges rough. She found a sewing room with a single machine and a window that faced the path. She found a narrow staircase that rose toward the bell, its steps smooth at the center, where feet had climbed in steady lines through years she could only imagine. Every room she entered felt like a held breath. None of it frightened her. Grief had sharpened and cooled inside her long ago. The heart finds a way to live with what it carries. Late in the afternoon, she pushed open the door to the chapel. The hinges gave a simple sound, and the room welcomed the new light as though it had been waiting for this very hour. Pews sat in clean rows, dusted by time but still sound. The altar stood plain and sure. A window of coloured glass caught the sun and poured a gentle red across the floor near the front. The air smelled faintly of old candle and cedar. Dorothy stepped down the aisle with slow feet and placed one hand on the end of the first pew. The wood had the warmth of things that were made to last. She set her lantern on the altar and did not light it. She did not need a flame to see. She simply stood and let her eyes settle. On the far side of the room, a small side door stood slightly ajar. She crossed to it and found a short passage that led to a storage alcove. Shelves lined the wall. On the middle shelf, a tin box sat square and centered, as if someone had placed it there with care and expected to return. The lid bore a small scratch in the shape of a cross. She lifted it and felt the weight before she opened it. Inside lay a bundle of papers tied with a narrow cotton ribbon that had browned with time. Dorothy set the box on the shelf, untied the ribbon, and raised the top sheet with patient hands. The paper was thin and had curled at the edges, but the ink still held. The handwriting leaned to the right in a steady hand that looked careful and sincere. The first line spoke of a Sunday morning when the church bell did not ring and a man stood alone outside the chapel door. He wrote of a promise that could not be kept and a faith that would not let go. He signed the name at the bottom, like a man who had learned to carry hope without bending it into demand. She did not read further right then. She placed the sheets back in the box and closed the lid with a quiet motion. She did not come to the convent hunting for ghosts. She came to breathe in a place where the earth spoke in simple tones, yet the box had waited, and the waiting felt like an invitation. She carried the tin to the altar and set it beside the lantern. She sat in the front pew and folded her hands in her lap. The colored light from the window marked the floor in a small square that shifted as clouds moved. The room held the kind of silence that lets a person hear what life has been trying to say for years. Evening came without hurry. The sky outside turned the color of ash and then the color of cool iron. Dorothy lit her lantern at last and watched the flames settle with a soft pulse. She opened the box again and read the first letter all the way through. The writer spoke in plain words. He wrote about work in the fields, about a road he walked on Sundays, about a woman who wore a simple habit and kept her eyes low and kind. He did not ask for anything in the letter. He simply told the truth of what his days had become and how the quiet inside the chapel steadied him when the world spun harder than he could bear. He closed with a single line that felt like a promise made to the air. Dorothy lifted the next letter and the next, careful not to tear the edges. Dates at the top marked years that had stretched long before her own life had joined with a man named Thomas in a small church 2 towns away. The letters were not dramatic. They did not hold big claims or heated pleas. They carried small details and steady faith. He wrote about rain that stayed for 3 weeks and a creek that rose over its bank. He wrote about harvest that failed 1 year and came back the next. He wrote about a candle that he kept near his window and how he would light it on Sundays, a quiet sign to himself that waiting can be a form of prayer. She set the pages down and let the weight of them sink in. The chapel did not feel empty anymore. It felt full with the kind of presence that comes when people have lived with care and left a trace that time respects. Dorothy looked at her hands and thought about the long road that had bent her life in ways she could not have planned. She had loved a man who worked without complaint and grew quiet near the end. She had known seasons of plenty and seasons of lean. She had known nights that held too much memory and mornings that asked for faith before the sun even reached the window. The letters did not stir old hurt. They set her in a place where memory could rest without demand. She closed the box and returned it to the shelf. She left the lantern on the altar and stepped outside for a little air. The night had taken the hills in a slow fold. A thin line of stars showed between moving clouds. Wind moved through the grass on the lower slope and made a sound like a soft brush across fabric. From the road came no sound at all. She stood on the stone step and drew a long breath. The convent did not not feel like a ruin, it felt like a keeper of lives. She felt no need to do more than live her days with steadiness and let the place do the same. When she went back to her room, she made a simple supper and ate with calm attention. She boiled more water and cleaned the small pan. She folded the quilt back and sat at the edge of the cot. The window let in a square of cool night. She watched it for a while and let her mind settle the way dust settles after a broom has passed. In that settling, she felt a kind of welcome that did not need words. She lay down and closed her eyes. Sleep came the way water comes to a field that has waited with patience. Before dawn, she woke to the small sound of a branch against the window. She rose, laced her boots, and stepped into the corridor. The chapel held its shape in the dim. She crossed the floor and sat in the front pew with hands open on her knees. She did not light the lantern right away. She let the first wash of day grow in the east window until the room took on a color that promised work and steady steps. When the light was enough, she stood and opened the box again. On top lay a sheet she had not lifted the night before. It had only a few lines. The words spoke of a choice made for the sake of a soul and a hope that stood taller than hunger. The lines did not accuse. They offered a blessing, simple and plain. Dorothy placed the letter back in its place and felt a change in the air, not a chill, not a fear, only a turn like the turn a season makes when it is ready. She understood then that her coming to the convent had not been a break from her life. It had been the next faithful step. She would tend the rooms and mend the garden. She would read when the day was done and rest when the work was enough. She would keep a small light where prayer had once lived in many voices. She would honor what the letters carried without pressing them for answers they could not give. Outside, morning widened. A faint gold touched the bell tower and ran along the ridge of the roof. Birds began their small talk among the branches. Dorothy eased the chapel door closed and stood in the corridor a moment more. She felt the floor solid under her feet. She felt the weight of the building lean not toward her, but with her. She moved toward the kitchen and set water to boil. The steam rose again in that fine line that never hurries. She held her cup between both hands and let the heat find her fingers. The day waited. She had time, and the work was honest. The letters would be there when evening came. The morning came slow, and the light carried the same quiet as the day before. The air was cold enough that Dorothy could see her breath as she stepped out to the courtyard. Dew covered the stone path like a thin film of glass. She moved carefully, her boots pressing soft marks into the earth. The hills beyond the convent still held a trace of mist, and a faint smell of wood smoke drifted from somewhere far off, a reminder that other lives continued, even when hers had folded into this silence. She began the day by tending the garden. The soil was stiff with the chill, but she loosened it little by little, her hands steady, her breath measured. Working there gave her rhythm, a kind that soothed the mind more than prayer. She found patches of old roots and weeds, and beneath them thin shoots of life clinging to the ground. It felt like proof that even when something seems forgotten, it keeps its hold. By mid-morning, she returned inside and walked through the chapel. The box of letters still rested on the altar, just as she had left it. She opened it again, and a faint smell of ink and dust lifted from the papers. The handwriting seemed more alive in the morning light. She lifted one letter and read it slowly. The words told of a small farm, of long weeks of work, and of a heart that found rest only in prayer. The writer spoke of a woman named Sister Margaret, of her voice, her calm, and the grace in her silence. Each letter was a confession without guilt, full of respect and love kept under restraint. It was not passion that filled those pages, but devotion, the kind that bends without breaking. Dorothy placed the letter down and rubbed her eyes. The way he wrote about the chapel, the candles, and the hills sounded so familiar. She could see it in her mind, though she had never been here before now. It unsettled her and comforted her at the same time. She wondered if places remember those who loved them, if their presence remains long after footsteps fade. She went to the back corridor and found a small door she had not opened. It led to what once must have been the sisters' quarters, narrow rooms with single beds and wooden crosses hung above each one. She moved from room to room, touching the walls as though she could feel their stories. In one of them, she found a small table with a cracked porcelain cup still resting on top. A thin layer of dust covered it, but the handle was intact. She cleaned it gently gently and carried it back to her room. It felt wrong to leave it behind. In the afternoon, she sat by the window, writing her own notes in a small notebook she had brought. She wrote about the letters, about the strange calm of the chapel, and about how the silence here did not feel empty. It felt filled, as though the air itself held memories. She wrote that she could sense a kindness in the walls, the kind that lingers after forgiveness. As the day turned golden, she decided to visit the small shed behind the convent. The door resisted, but after a firm push, it opened with a dry creak. Inside were old gardening tools, rusted shovels, and stacks of wooden crates. On one of the crates lay a metal candlestick with dried wax melted over its side. Dorothy picked it up and carried it inside. It belonged with the letters, she thought, a relic that once held their light. That evening she sat again in the front pew of the chapel. She lit the candle and watched the flame steady itself against the still air. She opened another letter. This one was shorter than the rest. The handwriting trembled slightly, the ink darker as if written in haste. It spoke of departure. The man wrote that he had come for the last time, that he could no longer bear to disturb what was sacred. He wrote that he had prayed for her peace, not his own. At the bottom again was the same name, Thomas. The name struck her differently this time. She whispered it aloud. It filled the empty space between her and the altar. The sound seemed to settle into the stones. Her heart gave a slow, uncertain beat. She stared at the letters, feeling something deep shift inside her. The name was not rare, she told herself, but still, the way he wrote, the tenderness in his words, it felt familiar. She remembered her husband's hands, the way he used to write short notes before leaving for work, the slight curve of his letters. The thought unsettled her. It was impossible. Her Thomas had been born years after these letters were written. Still, she could not push away the feeling that she was standing inside a story her life had brushed against, without ever knowing. Dorothy stayed there long after the candle burned low. The air grew cooler, the walls dimmed, and shadows gathered where the light could no longer reach. She thought about Sister Margaret and about the man who had written these words, how they had loved quietly, bound by duty and time. She felt no judgment for them, only understanding. Life was full of such choices, moments when love demanded silence rather than words. When the flame went out, Dorothy rose and walked back to her room. She left the letters on the altar, their edges glowing faintly in the last light that filtered through the stained glass. The hallway felt different now, not haunted but aware, as if the building itself recognized her. That night, sleep came slow. She lay awake listening to the sound of the wind pressing against the shutters. The boards creaked softly, steady like breathing. Sometime before dawn, she dreamed of the chapel again. In her dream, a woman stood by the altar, her head bowed, her hands folded. Dorothy could not see her face, only the faint outline of her figure and the shape of a candle flame beside her. The woman whispered something Dorothy could not hear. When she lifted her head, her eyes were kind but tired, and then she faded into light. Dorothy woke before sunrise. The air was colder than the night before. She sat up slowly, wrapping the quilt around her shoulders. The dream clung to her thoughts. She walked to the window and looked out at the hills. The first light of morning brushed the horizon, turning the mist into gold. She stayed there until the sun rose fully, its warmth reaching through the glass and touching her face. Later, she went back to the chapel. The candle had burned nearly to the end, its wax pooled across the altar. The box of letters waited in its place. She picked it up, not to read again, but to hold it. It no longer felt like a relic. It felt like a bridge between what had been and what still mattered. She set it down gently, took a breath, and whispered, "I'll keep the light burning." The words left her lips like a promise, one that did not belong to the past alone. They belonged to every soul that had ever waited for peace. The days slipped into a quiet pattern, each one folding gently into the next like the pages of an old book. The convent had become part of Dorothy's breath, part of her rhythm. The wind through the trees spoke softly in the mornings, and at night the wooden walls seemed to sigh as if settling deeper into peace. She rose with the light, tended to small things, sweeping the corridors, warming water for tea, mending the curtain that hung by her window. Her movements were slow, but they carried purpose. The letters stayed on the altar, waiting. Some mornings she only passed by them, her hand resting briefly on the lid of the tin box, as though to say she hadn't forgotten. Other mornings she read a single page, just enough to remind herself that love once walked these same floors in silence. Each word felt alive with the ache of waiting and the quiet dignity of restraint. It was not a story of romance, but of faith, and Dorothy understood that now more than ever. She often wondered about Sister Margaret. In the mornings, when light poured through the chapel windows and touched the empty pews, Dorothy imagined her there, a woman who had given everything to God and yet had known the pull of a human heart. She could almost see her kneeling in prayer, whispering words that no one would ever hear, asking forgiveness not for sin but for longing. Dorothy knew what that felt like, to want something and deny it out of love. One afternoon, while cleaning a corridor near the bell tower, she found a narrow staircase hidden behind a half-collapsed panel of wood. The steps were steep and uneven, spiraling upward toward a small room she hadn't noticed before. The air was thick with dust, but sunlight streamed through a circular window, cutting across the space in a beam of gold. Against the far wall stood an old wooden chest, its corners reinforced with rusted metal. Dorothy approached it slowly. The lock was broken, so she lifted the lid without effort. Inside were more papers, but these were different. Some were sermons, others were notes written in a softer, more personal hand. At the bottom, beneath a folded piece of linen, she found a small book bound in dark leather. She opened it carefully. The first page read, "Diary of Sister Margaret, 1951. Dorothy felt her pulse rise. She sat down on the floor beside the chest and began to read. The entries were simple, describing daily life, prayer, work, the tending of the poor. But as the pages turned, the tone changed. The writing grew more personal, more searching. Margaret spoke of a man who came each Sunday to deliver supplies from the nearby farm. She called him the Kind One. She wrote of how his voice reminded her of songs from her childhood, and how in his presence she felt something she had long thought she had buried. Dorothy turned the pages slowly, reading every word. The writing trembled at times, the ink darker where the pen must have lingered too long. Margaret wrote about the battle within her heart, between her vow and her humanity. She prayed for clarity, for strength, but her words carried the tone of someone who already knew her fate. In one entry she wrote, "He waits outside the chapel each Sunday after Mass. I tell him not to, but I find myself hoping he will." Dorothy paused. The image of the man waiting outside, week after week, felt painfully familiar. She could picture it, a young man standing with his hat in his hands, the morning sun cutting across his shoulders, the sound of the church bell echoing through the valley. She imagined his eyes searching for a glimpse of her through the chapel door. She imagined Margaret, torn between duty and love, whispering prayers to a God she trusted to understand. The last entry in the diary was dated September 3rd, 1953. "He is leaving tomorrow. I told him I cannot follow, though my heart has already gone. He said he will write, but I cannot answer. I will keep his letters as proof that love existed here, even if it must remain unspoken. If faith is to mean anything, it must also mean letting go." Dorothy closed the diary with shaking hands. She sat still for a long time, feeling the truth settle over her like the dust in that room. It was all there, the pain, the love, the surrender. Sister Margaret had chosen silence, and the man had chosen patience. Together they had built something invisible but real, something that had survived in paper and memory. When Dorothy finally stood, the room seemed brighter. The light through the window fell directly onto the chest, as if the day itself wanted to bless what had been found. She took the diary downstairs and placed it beside the box of letters on the altar. The two belonged together, two sides of the same promise, waiting decades to meet again. That night she could not sleep. She lay awake, listening to the wind slide through the cracks in the window. Every sound seemed charged with meaning. She thought of Thomas, her husband, her companion through so many years of quiet endurance. He had been a good man, but there were times he had withdrawn into himself, carrying thoughts he never shared. Dorothy had accepted his silences then, but now, reading these letters, she wondered what he had carried. The next morning, she brought the diary to her table and compared the handwriting in the letters with her husband's old notes she had kept in her Bible. The resemblance struck her like a touch of cold water. The same steady slant, the same loops in the letter G, the same restraint that avoided flourishes. Her heart ached with confusion. It could not be him. Not truly. The dates did not match, the years too far apart, and yet something in her refused to dismiss it. Perhaps the connection was not meant to be literal. Perhaps it was something deeper, a reflection, a circle closing through time. Maybe she had been brought here not to discover a secret about her husband, but to understand something about love itself, about the kind that waits, about the kind that forgives. In the afternoon, she walked to the edge of the property. The land rolled down gently toward a field lined with trees. She stood there, breathing in the stillness, and whispered a prayer, not for answers, but for peace. She asked that those two souls, Margaret and the man who had loved her, might finally rest. That evening, she lit the candle again. Its flame was small, but it filled the chapel with a soft glow that reached the far corners of the room. She placed her hand on the diary and the letters and said quietly, "Your story is safe now." The shadows shifted with the light, and for a moment, Dorothy thought she saw the faint outline of two figures near the back pew, one standing, one kneeling, their faces turned toward each other. The air grew still. Then the light flickered and the vision faded. Dorothy smiled, tears rising softly in her eyes. She did not need proof of what she had seen. Some things are meant to be felt, not explained. The candle burned steady through the night, and for the first time, the convent felt whole. The following days carried a softer rhythm. The air had warmed just enough to lift the frost from the hills, and the sound of dripping water came from the eaves each morning. Dorothy began rising earlier, drawn by the stillness of dawn. She found comfort in small acts, opening windows, sweeping the floor, trimming away the dead vines from the walls. Every motion felt like a quiet conversation with the building, a way of saying, "We are both still here." The chapel had become the heart of her days. Each morning she walked there barefoot, letting the cold stone wake her fully. The candle she had lit the night before always stood waiting, melted a little more but still holding its shape. The letters and diary remained on the altar, side by side, their paper yellowing gently under the sunlight that crossed through the broken stained glass. The glass scattered the light in fragments of color across the walls, soft gold, pale blue, muted red. Dorothy often paused to watch the colors shift, believing that this was how memory moved, quietly, constantly changing, but never truly gone. That week, she began restoring the garden. The ground was rough, but her hands were steady. She planted seeds she had bought in town, wildflowers, sage, and rosemary. Martha, the woman from the store, had given them to her as a gift, saying, "For a place that needs new life." Dorothy had smiled and promised to make them grow. As she worked, she hummed hymns she half remembered from childhood. The sound of her voice mingled with the breeze, gentle and unhurried. When she returned inside later that afternoon, she noticed something she hadn't before. The diary had shifted slightly from where she had left it. It wasn't far, only an inch or two, but enough to catch her eye. She froze for a moment, her heart giving a slow thump. The building was old, and wind could move anything left open, she told herself. Still, she felt the familiar presence again, not frightening, but watchful. That night a storm came through the valley. The sky darkened early, and the wind pushed against the shutters with long, steady groans. Dorothy lit her lanterns and closed the doors tight. The storm brought with it a strange mix of fear and peace. The sound reminded her that she was small, but safe. When the rain began to fall, it did so in wide sheets, hammering the roof, washing years of dust from the stone. In the middle of the storm, Dorothy went to the chapel. Water seeped in through cracks along the window, dripping onto the pews. She placed bowls under the leaks and wiped the floor with an old rag. When she looked toward the altar, the candle was flickering violently. She cupped her hand around it to steady the flame. The wind moaned through the gaps in the glass, and for a moment it sounded almost like a voice, low, drawn, and sorrowful. She closed her eyes and whispered, "You are not alone anymore." The words seemed to calm the air. The wind slowed, the candle steadied, and for the rest of the night the storm passed without harm. Dorothy stayed there until dawn, her back against the pew, her eyes fixed on the soft glow of the candle as it burned through the last of its wax. She did not sleep, but she rested, and that rest felt sacred. By morning, the storm had cleared. The convent looked different, cleaner somehow, its walls washed, its courtyard glistening with rainwater. Dorothy walked through the halls barefoot again, her steps leaving faint prints on the wet floor. The world smelled of new beginnings. In the chapel, the diary had fallen open to a page near the end. The ink was faint but legible. It read, "There is a peace I do not yet know, but I believe it is coming. When the rain returns, I will wait for it." Dorothy traced the words with her fingertip. She whispered, "It came." Days later, a man from town arrived with a small delivery, tools for the garden and a bag of flour. He introduced himself as Samuel, a carpenter sent by the church to check the old beams. He was kind, a little shy, and spoke with the plain ease of country people. Dorothy watched as he inspected the walls, tapping here and there with his hammer. "These bones will hold," he said. "All they need is care." Before leaving, Samuel stopped by the chapel. He looked around with quiet respect. "I used to come here with my mother," he said. "She said the sisters prayed for every soul who entered, even those who never spoke." Dorothy smiled softly. "Then I am in good company." After he left, she thought about what he had said. Prayed for every soul who entered. The idea lingered with her as she sat near the altar that evening. She opened her notebook and began writing again, not about sorrow, but about the grace of staying. She wrote that love sometimes outlives time, and that faith is often just patience made holy. The sun began to set as she wrote. The valley glowed with a soft copper light, and the air was still. From the open window came the faint scent of rain-soaked earth. She looked around the chapel, feeling how the years had layered here, joy, loss, forgiveness, and now renewal. For the first time since she had arrived, she felt certain that she was exactly where she was meant to be. That night, before she went to bed, she opened one of the old letters again. It was the first one, the one that had started everything. She read it aloud this time, her voice steady and clear. "Sometimes pain is not punishment, but the soil where grace begins to grow." The words filled the room, soft and strong. She felt them take root inside her, like a prayer answered without sound. As the candle burned low, Dorothy lifted her eyes toward the ceiling and whispered, "Wherever you are, I hope you've found peace." The flame flickered gently, as if in response. Then she smiled, closed the letter, and let the night settle around her like a warm blanket. Outside, the stars had returned, bright against the dark sky. The world was quiet again, washed clean, waiting for another dawn. The season turned again. The air that once smelled of rain now carried dust and warmth. Grass rose higher along the path leading to the main gate, bending with the wind, but never breaking. Dorothy had learned to walk that road with calm steps, her hands often folded behind her back, her gaze lifted toward the horizon. The world around the convent had changed little, yet inside her everything felt different. Time no longer pressed against her. It simply flowed through her, like a river that had stopped asking where it was going. Each day began with the same soft light creeping over the hills. She would rise before dawn, light a candle on the altar, and whisper a prayer for every soul that had once called this place home. She prayed not with words, but with stillness, her silence becoming a kind of offering. She no longer questioned the past, not the choices made by Sister Margaret, not the pain that had shaped her own life. Both women had carried love that refused to die quietly. Now, at last, that love had found a resting place. The garden had begun to bloom. Lavender brushed against rosemary, their scents rising in the warm air. Butterflies hovered in slow motion above the wildflowers. Dorothy tended them with patience, her fingers gentle on the stems. Sometimes she spoke aloud to the plants, telling them stories from her youth, stories of summers spent near rivers, of long days that had once felt endless. She did not mind that no one answered. The silence itself felt alive, as though it had learned to listen. One afternoon, as she weeded near the stone wall, she noticed something buried just beneath the soil, a corner of metal catching the sunlight. She brushed the dirt away and unearthed a small box, no bigger than her hand. Its hinges were rusted, but it opened easily. Inside lay a single folded page, brittle but still readable. The ink had faded to brown, yet the handwriting was careful, familiar. It was not one of the old letters she had found earlier. This one was new to her. It bore no name at the top, only a single sentence written across the middle. "Forgive me for leaving before you could answer." Dorothy read the line again and again. The air around her seemed to still. The breeze stopped. Even the birds grew quiet. She pressed the paper to her chest and closed her eyes. The words did not belong to her, yet somehow they did. They spoke to something she had carried for years, the weight of unsaid things, of partings that never had the right words. She whispered, "You are forgiven," and then folded the note carefully, placing it on the altar beside the diary and the box of letters. That evening the chapel glowed with the light of 3 candles. Dorothy sat in the front pew, her hands resting in her lap, her face calm. Outside, the wind moved softly through the fields. Inside, everything was still. She thought about the man who had written the letters, about Sister Margaret, and about her own life. 3 souls tied together not by time but by longing. Love, she had learned, did not fade. It simply changed form. It moved from one heart to another, from paper to prayer, from memory to peace. She began writing again that night, not in her notebook, but on small scraps of paper she kept in a drawer. Each note carried a single line, small truths she had come to understand. One read, "Grace often hides in the quiet." Another said, "Forgiveness is not forgetting, it is remembering without pain." She placed these notes in corners of the convent, inside books, beneath the pews, between the cracks of the wooden doors, small gifts for anyone who might one day come after her. Weeks passed like gentle breaths. Sometimes travelers came up the hill, young couples looking for old places to photograph, or wanderers seeking directions to towns beyond. Dorothy greeted them kindly, offering them water or a place to rest in the shade. Some stayed to pray in the chapel, drawn by a calm they couldn't explain. They often left with tears in their eyes, whispering that the place felt different, lighter, as if peace lived here. One day, a young woman stopped at the gate carrying a backpack and a notebook. She said she was writing about historic churches of the South and asked if she could see the convent. Dorothy welcomed her in, leading her through the corridors with quiet pride. The woman asked many questions, taking notes, her curiosity bright and gentle. When they reached the chapel, she grew silent. Her eyes traced the candles, the wooden cross, the small garden visible through the window. She turned to Dorothy and said softly, "It feels like someone is still praying here." Dorothy smiled. "Perhaps they are." The woman thanked her and left before sunset. That night, Dorothy sat by the window and watched the light fade. The hills turned violet, and the first stars appeared one by one. She thought of the visitors who would keep coming long after she was gone, the way stories carry themselves forward through time without needing names. She was not afraid of that. The convent would hold its peace, just as it had held its sorrow, and both would become one in the end. Later, she walked to the chapel for what felt like the 1,000th time. She knelt at the altar and looked at the letters, the diary, and the folded page she had found in the garden. She no longer needed to read them. Their words lived inside her now. She whispered, "Everything is forgiven." And in that moment, she felt something move through the air, a softness, a lightness, a quiet release. The candle flames bent gently, as if bowing in agreement. That night, she dreamed of a field filled with light. The sky was open and endless. In the distance, she saw 2 figures walking side by side. They did not look back, but she knew who they were. They walked toward a horizon that shimmered like water, their hands nearly touching. When Dorothy woke, her eyes were wet, but her heart was calm. The following morning, she brewed her tea and sat outside to watch the sunrise. The mist lifted slowly from the hills, and for a moment the world seemed suspended between night and day. She felt Thomas near her, not as a shadow or a memory, but as peace. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude. The words were simple. Thank you for letting me stay long enough to see what love can heal. As the sun rose higher, the convent filled with light. Every window caught the glow, every surface warmed. The walls that had once held sorrow now reflected peace. The story that had begun in pain had found its quiet end in grace. Dorothy stood, walked to the chapel one last time, and smiled at the candle still burning on the altar. Thank you for joining us in this story of faith and redemption. If it touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Sometimes, the most incredible stories are the ones that truly happened. The next mornings unfolded in the same calm light, though something about the air felt different. Softer, almost watchful. Dorothy had begun to rise earlier than ever, sometimes before the birds began their songs. The first thing she did each day was light the candle on the altar. It had become her quiet promise to the world that there would always be a small flame here, even if no one else remembered. The candle burned slowly, its light warm and unwavering, a symbol of the patience that had carried her this far. The convent seemed to breathe with her now. It no longer felt like a ruin left behind by time, but like a living thing, a heart with walls, windows and memory. The halls held the scent of lavender from the garden, and the floors, though worn, reflected the sunlight in gentle shades of gold. Dorothy had cleaned every corner, repaired what she could, and accepted what she couldn't. There was grace in both actions, in fixing what was possible and letting the rest be. She had stopped keeping track of days. Instead, she measured time by small moments. The way the light moved through the stained glass in the chapel, the way the wind rose over the hill each afternoon, the way her hands no longer trembled when she held the diary of Sister Margaret. Every moment was complete on its own. There was no need to rush toward anything. Sometimes, when she sat near the chapel window at dusk, she would hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor. They were light and even, like those of someone who knew the way by heart. Dorothy never turned to look. She simply smiled and whispered, "I know you're here." There was peace in accepting that some presences were not meant to be seen, only felt. The townspeople had begun to visit more often. Word of the convent's renewal had spread quietly, like a story retold around dinner tables. Some came out of curiosity, others to pray, others simply to breathe in the stillness that surrounded the place. Dorothy welcomed them all with gentle kindness. She offered tea to travelers, candles to those who wished to pray, and silence to those who needed it most. She never spoke of the letters or the diary. Some stories, she believed, belonged to the walls themselves. One Sunday, a small family arrived, a couple with a little girl who could not have been more than 6 years old. The child ran through the courtyard laughing, her voice bright against the stone. She stopped near the garden and crouched beside the rosemary, pressing her face close to the leaves. Dorothy watched from the steps, smiling. The girl looked up and said, "It smells like home." Dorothy nodded. "Maybe that's what this place is for," she said softly, "to remind us that home can be found again." The couple stayed through the afternoon. The woman told Dorothy that they had lost their house in a fire the previous winter and had been traveling since. Dorothy listened quietly, then offered them a small room to rest for the night. She prepared a simple meal, bread, soup, and tea, and they ate together in the kitchen. The little girl drew pictures on scraps of paper, her crayons moving in small, focused circles. When she showed Dorothy her drawing, it was of the convent, a tall house with glowing windows and a bright light inside. "That's your candle," the girl said proudly. "It never goes out." After the family left the next morning, Dorothy went to the chapel and looked at the candle. It burned steady as always, untouched by drafts or time. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps its light truly would never fade, not because of wax or wick, but because of what it meant. Days later, while she was tending the garden, Martha came walking up the hill. Dorothy hadn't seen her since the first few weeks she'd moved in. Martha carried a small basket filled with apples and smiled when she reached the gate. "I wanted to see what you've done with the place," she said. "Word in town is you've brought it back to life." Dorothy laughed softly. "I didn't do much. It already knew how to heal. I just gave it time." They walked through the convent together. Martha ran her hand along the walls and nodded approvingly. "It feels different," she said, "lighter." When they reached the chapel, she stopped and looked around in silence. The candle's flame reflected in her eyes. "Do you ever feel lonely here?" she asked. Dorothy thought for a moment before answering. "Not anymore. Loneliness comes when we forget that silence is alive. Here, silence keeps me company." Martha smiled gently. "Then maybe I should spend more time listening." They shared tea in the garden before Martha left, promising to return before the harvest. After she disappeared down the hill, Dorothy sat under the old oak tree near the gate and watched the sun move lower in the sky. She thought about how much had changed, not just in the convent, but in herself. When she first arrived, she had been a woman carrying the weight of years. Now she felt light, not because her past had vanished, but because it had found a place to rest. As night came, the air grew still again. Dorothy walked to the chapel, as she always did before sleeping. She lit the candle, knelt before the altar, and whispered her prayer, the same one she had said every night since she arrived. "Thank you for the light that never leaves, even when no one is watching." The flame flickered once, as if acknowledging her words. Then it steadied. The shadows of the pews stretched long across the floor. She watched the light move and thought about how everything, sorrow, faith, love, eventually returns to the same stillness. The candle burned until the stars filled the windows above. Outside, the night carried the faint hum of crickets, the slow rhythm of wind in the trees. Inside, the chapel stood wrapped in peace. Dorothy lingered there, her hands resting on the wooden pew, her eyes soft with gratitude. She did not need answers anymore. She had learned that the mystery itself was the gift, that some stories are meant to remain half-remembered, kept alive not by words, but by faith. When she finally rose to leave, she looked once more at the candle, its small flame glowing steady against the dark. It no longer belonged to the past or the present. It belonged to both, and to everything that waited quietly beyond. The mornings in the valley began to stretch longer, holding their light with a gentler hand. The air smelled faintly of pine and warm earth, and the hills shimmered beneath the haze of approaching summer. Dorothy walked the grounds before sunrise, her steps slow, steady, familiar. The garden had grown wild and full, its colors deepening with each day. Bees moved lazily among the lavender, and the tall grass swayed in rhythm with the wind that came rolling off the hills. She had learned the way the world spoke when it was content, a slow murmur, quiet but certain. The convent itself seemed to glow now. The cracks in the walls had softened, filled with moss and sunlight. Dust no longer clung to the air. The corridors that once echoed with emptiness now hummed faintly with life. The sound of wind through open windows, the creak of floorboards expanding in warmth, the faint clatter of Dorothy's tea kettle from the kitchen. Even the silence had changed. It was no longer hollow. It was peaceful, settled, almost sacred. Each morning she lit the same candle on the altar. Its flame had become her compass, a reminder that each day deserved care, no matter how ordinary. She spoke to it as one speaks to a friend. "You've burned through many nights," she would whisper. "Keep watch a little longer." The flame always answered in its quiet way, a small flicker, a soft lean toward her voice. One afternoon, as she swept the floor of the chapel, she found an envelope tucked beneath the first pew. The paper was thin, folded neatly, sealed with a drop of wax so dry it crumbled beneath her fingers. There was no name written on it, only the faint outline of a cross drawn in pencil. She hesitated before opening it, then unfolded the paper slowly. The message was short. "There is no goodbye in grace, only return." Dorothy read the line 3 times. The handwriting was different from the others, smoother, almost feminine. She wondered if Sister Margaret had written it for herself, perhaps as a final reflection before leaving. Or maybe it had been left by someone else, another caretaker, another soul who had once lived here in silence and found what she had found, peace. She placed the note beside the candle and let its meaning settle within her. The days grew warmer. The sky stayed clear for weeks. Birds nested near the roof, and sometimes their soft chirping drifted through the chapel during morning prayer. Dorothy had taken to writing again, filling page after page in her small notebook. Her handwriting, once shaky, had grown steady, patient. She wrote about forgiveness and time, about how the earth heals itself without asking permission. She wrote that love never ends, only changes its shape. Visitors came and went. A young priest from the nearby town stopped by once a month, always bringing supplies, flour, oil, candles, and sometimes small gifts from the parish women. He would stay for tea, and they would talk about simple things, the weather, the crops, the way people clung to hope even when they had little else. One afternoon, he asked if she ever felt afraid, living alone in such a large, quiet place. Dorothy smiled and said, "No, fear leaves when love has room to breathe." The priest nodded, and after a moment he whispered, "Then you've turned this house into a prayer." Those words stayed with her long after he had gone. She began to see the convent as something beyond brick and wood, a living act of devotion, shaped by every hand that had cared for it, every soul that had sought shelter within its walls. The idea filled her with comfort. She no longer wondered whether she had done enough in life or whether she had loved rightly. The answer had already been written in her days here. That evening, as the sun sank low behind the hills, Dorothy stood at the garden gate watching the light fade. The sky glowed in shades of pink and soft orange, and a single cloud stretched thin like silk across the horizon. She whispered a line she remembered from one of the old letters, "As long as the light still burns, I will keep waiting." The words no longer sounded like longing, they sounded like peace. Later, inside the chapel, she noticed something she hadn't before. When the candlelight reached the old stained glass just right, the image on the window, once clouded by age, revealed a faint figure. It was a woman kneeling, her hands open, her head bowed in prayer. The glass had faded over time, but the outline was still visible. Dorothy stared at it for a long while, realizing it was meant to be Saint Margaret, the patron of forgiveness. A small smile touched her face. "You've been here all along," she whispered. That night she dreamed again, not of the past this time, but of the present, alive and filled with quiet grace. In the dream, she was walking through the chapel, the light golden and warm. She saw the benches full, not with people, but with the shapes of light, soft, human, glowing. They sat in perfect stillness, their faces peaceful, their hands resting on open laps. She did not feel afraid. She felt loved, surrounded by souls that had never left. When she woke, dawn was just beginning. She went straight to the chapel and lit the candle once more. The dream lingered in her mind like the aftertaste of something sweet. She thought about all the people who had once prayed here, about the generations who had loved and lost and come seeking meaning. They were all part of this place, and so was she. Dorothy spent that morning writing one final page in her notebook. The words came easily, clear and sure. Peace is not the absence of pain, but the space where love can rest. When she finished, she closed the book and placed it beside the others in the small wooden box. She did not plan to take it with her when she left someday. It belonged here, with the rest, part of the story, part of the silence. That evening, as the last light faded from the sky, Dorothy sat by the window with her cup of tea. The sound of the crickets filled the air, and the hills turned dark and soft beneath the stars. She thought of Sister Margaret, of Thomas, of everyone who had ever waited for something beyond themselves. She no longer felt separate from them. She was one of them, part of the same long prayer stretching through time. Before going to bed, she looked once more toward the candle. Its flame was smaller tonight, tired but steady. She whispered, "I'll keep it burning until morning." And in that promise, she found everything she had ever needed: love that endures, faith that forgives, and light that never truly dies. The sun climbed higher each morning now, its light spilling like honey across the valley. The air was warmer, the sky broader, the silence deeper. Time had softened everything, the walls, the hills, the weight in Dorothy's heart. The convent no longer felt old. It felt eternal, as if every stone had finally accepted its place in the world. She had come to know the sound of its peace. It lived in the rhythm of the wind, in the creak of the wooden doors, in the faint echo of her steps through the long hallways. The candles still burned each morning and each evening. She had grown grown used to its steady glow, its quiet flicker that felt like breath. The wax melted slowly, layer upon layer, each day leaving a mark of time that could not be measured by clocks. She no longer thought of it as her candle. It belonged to something greater, to all the souls who had ever needed a light to see through the dark. One afternoon, while working near the garden wall, Dorothy found a small bird tangled in a vine. Its wing fluttered weakly, trapped by the stems. She knelt and freed it carefully, her hands soft but sure. The bird stayed a moment in her palm, trembling, before it lifted and flew toward the open sky. She watched it go until it disappeared into the trees. For a long time she stood there, her hands still open, feeling the warmth it had left behind. Life, she thought, was much the same. Fragile, frightened, but always reaching for freedom. She had started receiving letters from the townspeople. Some were invitations, others were simply notes of gratitude. They thanked her for restoring the convent, for welcoming travelers, for creating a place of peace when the world outside seemed restless. Dorothy would sit by the window and read them one by one, her lips curving into small smiles. She never replied with long words, only simple ones. "You are always welcome here." That was enough. One evening, Martha returned, this time with her grandson, a boy of about 10. His hair was a tangle of sunlight, and his hands were full of wildflowers he had picked along the path. He ran through the courtyard, laughing as his voice echoed against the stone. Dorothy smiled, the sound of his joy filling the air like a hymn. Martha said softly, "It's been a long time since I've seen him smile like that." Dorothy looked toward the boy and said, "Then this place was waiting for him too." They stayed for supper. As the night settled in, Martha told Dorothy about the changes in town, how new families had arrived, how the church had begun holding small gatherings again, how people spoke of the convent as a place that had been brought back to life. Dorothy listened quietly, her hands folded around her teacup. "It wasn't me," she said. "It was the waiting that did it. Sometimes all a place needs is someone willing to stay long enough." After Martha and the boy left, Dorothy walked through the chapel again. She carried a broom, though there was little dust left to chase away. The pews were clean, the air fresh, the light soft and warm. She paused near the altar and noticed something she hadn't seen before, a single feather resting on the floor. It was small and white, caught between two planks of wood. She picked it up and smiled, remembering the bird she had freed days earlier. She placed it beside the candle, feeling it belonged there. That night, she wrote another line in her notebook. "Love always leaves something behind, a warmth, a feather, a light." Then she closed the cover and placed it inside the wooden box, beside the others. The box had become her own small archive of grace, each page a whisper to anyone who might come after. She imagined a stranger finding it one day, perhaps years from now, and understanding that the convent had never truly been empty. As the days stretched longer, Dorothy's body began to slow. Her steps grew smaller, her rest deeper, but her spirit felt lighter than ever. She no longer carried the weight of what she could not change. Each morning she walked through the corridors, touching the walls with her fingertips, thanking them for holding her. The wood was warm to the touch, the stone smooth beneath her hand. "You've done well," she would say softly, as though speaking to an old friend. One afternoon, as the wind moved gently through the garden, Dorothy sat on the bench she had built months earlier. The air shimmered with heat, and the hills in the distance looked soft and golden. She thought of her husband, of Thomas, his quiet laughter, his steady hands, the way his voice had softened near the end. She no longer felt the ache of loss when she remembered him. What she felt now was gratitude for having loved him, for having been loved, for having been led here by a story neither of them had understood fully until now. The candle still burned that evening. Though Dorothy noticed the wick had grown shorter, she smiled, knowing it would soon need to be replaced. She thought of all the hands that had once lit candles in this same place, each for their own reason, for faith, for forgiveness, for memory. She whispered, "Your lights have not gone out. They've only moved from flame to heart." The next morning, she woke to a deep stillness. The air was cool, the sky painted with grey light. She rose, slower than usual, and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. The convent seemed to wait for her as though holding its breath. She walked to the chapel, her feet bare on the stone floor. The candle stood there, nearly spent, its flame small but steady. Dorothy sat in the front pew and closed her eyes. The silence around her was full, not of absence, but of presence. It felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else. Hours passed, though she did not feel them. She sat there until the light through the stained glass began to fade. The candle's flame trembled, then straightened, burning one final time before going still. Dorothy smiled softly and whispered, "It's enough." Outside, the wind rose through the fields, carrying with it the scent of rosemary and wild sage. The hills glowed under the setting sun, and the sound of birds filled the sky. The convent stood silent, but not alone. Within its walls lingered a warmth that would not fade, the echo of prayers, the memory of forgiveness, and the quiet triumph of a life that had found peace. The morning after the candle went out, the valley lay under a veil of soft fog. The mist rolled slowly across the hills, curling around the cypress trees and gathering along the stone path that led to the convent gate. The light came late that day, filtering through in pale streaks that touched the earth gently, as though careful not to disturb what rested. Inside, everything was still. The air held a quiet so deep that even the smallest sound, a bird outside, the distant hum of wind, seemed sacred. Dorothy sat by the chapel window, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. Her hands rested in her lap, open, unhurried. The candle on the altar had burned itself to nothing during the night, leaving behind a small pool of hardened wax that caught the morning light. She studied it for a long time. It did not sadden her. Instead, she saw in that little pool of wax all that she had learned, that every flame eventually gives its light to the world and then rests, content that it has done its work. The silence of the chapel was rich with presence. Though she sat alone, Dorothy could feel the nearness of those who had once walked these halls. She imagined Sister Margaret kneeling in the corner where the light fell through the glass, her lips moving softly in prayer. She could almost hear the echo of Thomas's voice, low and warm, reading aloud from one of his old letters. There was no fear in these imaginings, only tenderness. She felt as though time itself had folded around her, letting the living and the gone exist in one quiet breath. Later that morning, a soft knock came at the front door. It startled her at first. Few people ever came so early. When she opened it, Samuel stood there, hat in hand, the familiar kindness in his eyes. "Morning, Ma'am," he said. "Thought I'd check the roof beams. The rain's been heavy." Dorothy smiled. "The roof's held well, Samuel, but you can look if you wish." He followed her through the hallways, inspecting corners, tapping the wooden beams with practiced hands. The building creaked under his touch, but nothing groaned or gave. "She's a strong one," he said. Dorothy nodded. "She's been waiting for a long time. I think she just needed someone to listen." Samuel smiled gently at that. "Places remember kindness," he said, "and they remember care." When he finished his inspection, they sat for a while in the kitchen. Dorothy poured tea, and they spoke of small things, the new families moving into the town, the harvest that promised to be good this year, the children who played near the creek where the water ran clear. Before leaving, Samuel stood and said, "You've made this place alive again, Miss Dorothy. It's good to see it breathe." She smiled, her eyes soft. "It always knew how. I only stayed long enough to watch." After he left, the afternoon light deepened, and the sound of cicadas filled the warm air. Dorothy walked through the garden, trailing her hand lightly along the tops of the lavender. Bees hovered lazily between blossoms, their hum steady and sure. The scent of rosemary and sage wrapped around her. She sat on the bench beneath the oak tree and closed her eyes. The world pulsed quietly, the slow rhythm of life continuing, of breath and earth and memory woven together. As she rested there, she thought again of the letters, how they had waited for decades to be found, how they had carried sorrow without bitterness. She realized that her time here had been much the same. She had come to this convent seeking rest, but what she had found was forgiveness, not only for the past she carried, but for all the unfinished stories life leaves behind. Every moment, every wound had led her here, to this peace that asked for nothing in return. Evening came soft and gold. The light slipped through the open windows, stretching long across the chapel floor. Dust moved through the beams of light, each speck glowing for a heartbeat before fading again. Dorothy sat in the front pew, her hands folded, her breath calm. She could feel the rhythm of her heartbeat slowing, matching the quiet pulse of the building around her. The air was warm, the world gentle. As twilight deepened, the first stars began to appear over the hills. Dorothy stood and walked to the altar one last time. She placed her hand on the small pool of wax where the candle had melted down. The wax was smooth and cool. She whispered, "You've done your work well." Then she turned toward the door and looked at the room that had been her companion through every season, the walls that had held her silence, the light that had carried her prayers. That night, she sat at her desk and opened her notebook. There were still a few blank pages left. She began to write without thinking, her words simple and clear. "I came here with sorrow and leave with peace. If someone should find these pages, know this: love endures. Time changes it, but it never ends. Whatever waits beyond the hill, I go to it without fear." When she finished, she closed the notebook and placed it in the wooden box with the letters and Sister Margaret's diary. She ran her hand once across the lid, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her palm. Then she stood, walked to her small bed, and sat for a long time watching the moonlight through the window. The world outside shimmered faintly, silver on the grass, gold at the horizon. She lay down, still watching that light, her breathing slow and even. The wind moved gently through the garden, carrying the scent of wildflowers through the open window. The stars turned silently over the hills. Dorothy's eyes drifted closed, and a faint smile touched her face. The next morning, the sun rose strong and bright over the valley. The first rays reached the chapel window, filling it with gold. Martha came walking up the path just after dawn, bringing fresh bread as she often did. When she stepped inside, she called out Dorothy's name, her voice soft but hopeful. The only answer was silence. Not empty, but full, the kind of silence that feels like completion. In the chapel, the air glowed with morning light. The wooden box sat closed on the altar, the candle beside it new and waiting to be lit. A small white feather lay next to it, trembling slightly in the breeze that slipped through the open window. Martha stood there for a long moment, her eyes misted but her heart steady. She whispered, "Rest easy, Dorothy. You kept the light burning." Then she struck a match, touched the flame to the new candle's wick, and watched as the small fire caught and rose, steady, bright, and alive again. Outside, the fields stretched wide beneath the sun. The convent stood quiet, strong, eternal. The wind carried the scent of rosemary, the hum of bees, the murmur of a world that keeps on turning, and inside the flame burned once more, not as a farewell, but as a promise. The candle's new flame burned quietly through the morning, its light falling over the chapel in warm, golden strokes. Outside, the sun climbed above the hills, scattering the fog and waking the fields with brightness. Birds perched on the roof, calling to each other in short, cheerful bursts. The air smelled of lavender and rain that had passed in the night. Inside the convent, all was calm, as though the very walls understood what had taken place. A passing not marked by sorrow, but by fulfillment. Martha remained for several hours that day. She cleaned the kitchen, opened the windows, and walked through the garden where Dorothy had planted the flowers. Everywhere she looked, she saw signs of care, tools cleaned and stacked neatly, a broom leaning in its place, the notebook on the altar box, closed and ready for whoever would come next. When she stepped into the chapel again, the light from the candle painted her face in a soft glow. She whispered a prayer of thanks, her voice barely louder than breath. Word of Dorothy's passing spread slowly through the town. When Samuel heard, he rode up the hill the following afternoon. He tied his horse at the gate and stood for a long time before entering, his hat pressed against his chest. He walked through the hall in silence, touching the stone walls lightly as though greeting an old friend. The sound of his boots echoed once, then softened as he reached the chapel. The sight of the candle, still burning, brought tears to his eyes. He knelt in the first pew and bowed his head. He stayed there for a long time. When he finally rose, he opened the wooden box on the altar. Inside lay Dorothy's notebook, the letters and the diary. He read a few lines of the last page, the one she had written before resting. The words spoke of peace, of love that waits, of light that continues beyond sight. Samuel closed the book gently, his hand lingering on the cover. "You did what you came to do," he said softly. "You kept the promise. Over the next few weeks, people began visiting the convent more often. Some came to pray, others to help maintain the garden Dorothy had left behind. They brought tools, flowers, and candles. The place that had once stood forgotten now breathed with quiet life. The air filled again with laughter, the kind that rises from children playing in the courtyard, their voices carried by the wind. Martha took care of the chapel in those first months. She learned to light the candle each morning, just as Dorothy had. Every evening she would sit in the front pew, watching the flame move, and think about the woman who had turned a place of ruin into a sanctuary of peace. "You left us something good," she would say, "something we needed." One late afternoon, as summer reached its fullest warmth, a small group from the church came to hold a service in Dorothy's memory. They read from her notebook, the simple lines she had written about love and grace. No one wept. They smiled instead, listening to the soft hum of wind through the open door and the song of the birds outside. When the priest spoke, he said, "Some souls mend more than themselves." She was one of them. After the service, Martha and Samuel stayed behind. The light from the sunset poured through the stained glass, setting the chapel in shades of crimson and gold. Dust drifted through the air like tiny stars. Martha looked toward the altar. "She said once that silence can be alive," she whispered. "I think I understand now." Samuel nodded. "She made it so." From that day on, the convent became known in the valley as the House of the Last Light. Travelers stopped there for rest, leaving behind small tokens, notes of gratitude, pressed flowers, candles half burned. Some said they could feel peace settle over them the moment they crossed through the gate. No one ever spoke loudly inside. Even laughter took on a softer tone, as though the air itself asked for reverence. Years passed. The roof held through storms, and the walls stayed strong. The garden continued to bloom every spring, the same lavender and rosemary that Dorothy had planted returning faithfully, their scent carried through the valley. The wooden bench beneath the oak tree aged with time, its surface worn smooth by the touch of many hands, but no one ever removed it. It remained part of the place, simple, enduring, patient. One autumn evening, as the sky burned orange behind the hills, a young woman arrived at the convent. She was tired from travel, her face marked by dust and distance. Martha, now older and slower, greeted her at the gate. "Come in, dear. You look like you've been searching for something." The woman smiled faintly. "Maybe I have," she said. "Someone told me this is a place for lost souls." Martha led her inside. The woman stopped in the chapel doorway, her eyes drawn immediately to the candle on the altar. It burned steady, just as it always had. "How long has it been burning?" she asked quietly. Martha smiled. "Long enough for you to find it." The young woman stayed for a week. She helped in the garden, swept the corridors, and spent long hours in the chapel, silent but thoughtful. On her last night, she placed a small folded note beside the wooden box. When Martha found it the next morning, it read, "The light found me. Thank you." Time continued its gentle turning. The world outside changed. Roads widened, new buildings rose, people came and went, but the House of the Last Light remained. The candle was never allowed to die. When one burned down, another was lit from its flame, keeping the line unbroken, a single thread of fire stretching through the years. Even when no one was inside, the chapel seemed alive. The air always carried a faint warmth, and at dawn, the sunlight through the window fell perfectly across the altar, illuminating the candle's flame as though blessing it anew each day. The place that had once known sorrow had become a home for healing. One night, many years later, an old woman who had once been that young traveler returned. Her hair had turned silver, her hands marked by time. She lit the candle herself, whispering the same words that had been passed down through the years. "Thank you for the light that never leaves." She sat for a long while in the pew, her eyes soft, her heart at peace. When she left, she paused at the doorway and looked back. The candle's flame shone steady, the air around it golden and still. She smiled and whispered, "Dorothy, you did it. The light is still here." Outside, the valley stretched wide and endless beneath the stars. The wind carried the scent of lavender and earth. The old convent stood quietly, the candle flickering through the window, its glow a gentle promise that some things, faith, love, forgiveness, never truly end. Years continued their slow procession across the valley, and with them the convent's story deepened into something timeless. The House of the Last Light remained, quiet and steadfast, as the world around it moved on in cycles of growth and decay. The hills turned green with spring and gold with autumn. Rains came and went. Winds whispered through the garden where lavender still bloomed, faithful as memory. Every petal that opened seemed to carry a small echo of Dorothy's care, as if the earth itself remembered the hands that had tended it. Visitors never stopped arriving. They came alone, in pairs, in small groups, teachers, travelers, widows, sons, daughters, strangers with tired eyes and open hearts. Some came seeking faith. Others came only to sit in the silence. They brought their burdens quietly and left them without needing to explain. The convent took them all, held their sorrow for a while, and gave them back a piece of peace. Inside the chapel, the wooden box remained upon the altar. Its surface had darkened with age, but its presence felt eternal. The candle still burned, one flame born from another, a chain of light unbroken since Dorothy's hands first struck a match. Martha had passed years ago, her own life folded gently into the same calm grace. But before she left, she had taught the next keeper the rhythm of tending the flame, of keeping the garden alive, of letting the silence stay sacred. Among those who came often was the young woman who had once left the note that said, "The light found me." Her name was Clara. She had grown older, though her heart still carried the wonder of that first visit. It was she who had promised to keep the light burning after Martha. She never thought of herself as the new caretaker. She preferred to call herself the listener. "Dorothy listened," she once said, "so I must too." Clara lived in the small room Dorothy had once used. She never changed it much, only replaced the quilt when it frayed and mended the window latch when it loosened. She spent her mornings walking through the same fields Dorothy had walked, watching the mist lift off the hills, breathing in the same sweet scent of rosemary. In the afternoons, she wrote letters, not to anyone, but for them, small messages she would leave tucked into cracks between the pews or beneath the garden stones. Some of the notes said simple things: "You are not alone." Others held quiet truths: "Peace takes the shape of patience." Once she wrote, "Every soul that has waited in this place has taught the walls how to pray." Visitors found those notes by accident, and when they did, they often wept, not from sadness, but from the feeling of being understood without a word exchanged. The town had changed by then. New roads reached the valley. Cars passed more often on the dirt road that once saw only carts and horses. Still, no one disturbed the convent. Even the youngest knew to lower their voices when walking past it, as though the very air asked for respect. It had become something between a legend and a promise, a place where time and faith met in the middle and refused to part. One morning, Clara found herself sitting by the chapel window, the same one where Dorothy had once sat with tea in hand. The candle burned softly beside her, its flame steady and sure. She thought of all the hands that had held this flame before her. Sister Margaret, Thomas, Dorothy, Martha. Each had loved, each had waited, each had forgiven, each had left behind a trace of grace. Clara whispered, "You're all still here." The words carried through the quiet, soft but sure, and the air around her seemed to warm in response. She opened the wooden box, reading again from Dorothy's final note. "Whatever waits beyond the hill, I go to it without fear." Clara smiled through her tears. She understood now that every soul who came here had walked the same road, from sorrow to peace, from burden to light. The convent was not a place to escape life, but to meet it honestly, to stand still long enough for love, to speak in silence. That evening a storm moved across the horizon, dark clouds tumbling over the hills like smoke. The wind rose and rattled the shutters, and rain began to fall in thick, heavy drops. Clara lit the candle again, shielding its flame with her hand. The room filled with the scent of wax and wet earth. The light flickered against the walls, illuminating the faces in the old stained glass, saints, angels, and one familiar figure in a faded corner, a woman with her head bowed, her hands folded in peace. Clara whispered, "You are remembered," and the storm quieted. When dawn came, the rain had passed, and the air smelled clean, as though the world had been washed. Clara stepped outside and walked through the garden. Drops of water clung to the lavender, glittering in the morning light. The earth felt alive beneath her feet. She could hear the soft hum of bees returning to work, the sound of life continuing. That day, she decided to add one final note to Dorothy's collection. She took a small piece of parchment and wrote, "Every light that burns teaches another to shine. The waiting is over. The story continues." She placed the note inside the box and closed the lid. Then she lit a new candle from the old one and set it on the altar. The flame rose bright and golden, steady as a heartbeat. Years later, when people spoke of the House of the Last Light, they said that no matter how dark the night, there was always a glow visible through its window. Some said it was faith, some said it was memory. Others believed it was love, the kind that does not vanish when life ends, but carries on quietly, finding new hands, new hearts, new homes. And when travelers came to the chapel in silence, when they sat before the candle and felt warmth spread through their chest, none of them knew exactly whose prayer they were feeling. Perhaps it was Sister Margaret's, perhaps it was Thomas's, perhaps it was Dorothy's, still lingering in the air, or perhaps it was theirs, joining the rest, becoming part of a story without an ending. The wind moved through the hills, soft and endless. The light through the window trembled, then steadied again. Inside the chapel, time kept its patient rhythm, holding together what the world had once broken apart. The flame burned on, a single line of gold in the quiet heart of Tennessee, the last light, the living proof that love always finds a way to remain.